Good morning. Today we come face to face with the primary Christian symbol, and that symbol is a cross. The cross is a heart-breaking reminder that Jesus really suffered. I think that sometimes we Protestants deny ourselves some of the reality of the suffering Jesus because we always have an empty cross. We celebrate the fact that Christ is risen, and that will be a celebration for us. We do not dwell on the crucified Christ, and rightly so, but that will not do for today. Today is the day to dwell on the crucified Christ, the Christ who suffered real pain, sweated real sweat, bled real blood, and who wept real tears of frustration and anger. And as we contemplate the cross, we inevitably come to the question, why? Was it God's will that Jesus should die in this way? Or was it the sin of those who were responsible for this awful deed, acting contrary to God's will? There are texts which speak of Jesus being obedient to his Father's will. The Apostle Paul states quite clearly that in a number of passages. On their own, these texts could give the impression that it was God who willed that Jesus die this terrible death. If this is so, if God can will something as unjust and as evil as the murder of the innocent Jesus, what hope is there for us to find any meaning in life? The crucifixion would only increase our belief and fear over the power of a fate over which we have no control. On the other hand, when we turn to Jesus, we find that far from causing him to doubt God or God's goodness or God's saving power, it was Jesus' faith in God that sustained him through the ordeal. Jesus certainly expected the crucifixion because the only way for him to avoid the cross was to stop loving, to stop proclaiming God's justice, to stop challenging false religion. This he refused to do. He continued to minister to those perceived as outcasts, and he continued to love effectively, powerfully, and continually. Jesus was sustained by his total conviction concerning God's love for him, and indeed God's love for all. His teaching was that God is love, that God is not a God who inflicts suffering on people. In spite of what was happening to him and the death that was looming up before him, Jesus spoke of God as one who did not, who could not change that fact. The God of Jesus is not the cause of anything negative or unloving. Jesus taught and showed us by example that there is nothing that can separate us from God's love, not even sickness nor death. For while death is the end of mortal life, death marks a new beginning in our relationship with God, or the beginning of a new relationship with God. Jesus kept on teaching. This is what he taught, teaching it to the end, and he kept believing it. The crucifixion was an act of murder done in God's name. It was a flagrant act of injustice. As such, it was a sin, and so done against the will of God. It was God's presence that sustained Jesus during his agony. It was God's love that surrounded him during his passion. It was to God that he handed over his life from the cross. In the words of the letter to the Hebrews, for the sake of the joy which was still in the future, he endured the cross, disregarding the shamefulness of it. God's role in the crucifixion was precisely the resurrection. Jesus' death, not the fact that he died, but the way he died, enables us to believe. Jesus enables us to believe that no suffering inflicted on us by others or as a consequence of living in this world can ever separate us from the love of God. It's the crucifixion of Jesus that invites us to ask the question today, what is truth? When anyone gives her or his life to others, it raises starker and deeper questions around life and death, around justice and injustice, around power and vulnerability. It makes us reflect on what is worth dying for and what that might achieve. When we sit at the foot of the cross, we do so today and tomorrow, through Saturday, there is inevitably a confrontation that stops us in our journeying and challenges everything before us in a new way. If someone is prepared to pay this price for what they believe, then we must look seriously at what was before them and what lies before us. When Jesus says to Pilate that his kingdom is not from here, what does he mean? Could it be that what we see as valuable and worthy of power in our lives is challenged by those which Christ sees as worth dying for? Today, as I preach on this Durrag land, on this noisy corner of the world, perhaps you have heard the sounds of the vehicles' voices that have been travelling past. For we are people who are to be in the world. I don't want to edit them out because we are people to be in the world. We are people, the cross causes us to turn towards the world and look for the possibilities of God beyond our church walls. And there we're called to go and celebrate. Or at this time, after this disaster, we're to go to help be with people. To be with people as they take stock of their lives. To be with people in their need of the daily necessities. This is the cross before which we sit at this time. The cross that prompts us, through Jesus dying on it, to be people in the world because we know of the resurrection. And that is a gift, God's gift to us at this time. And that is why we really have to look at the cross today, to see the suffering love that was nailed there, because it reveals the depth of God's love for us, a love that will not let us go. Jesus knew that. Do we? Amen.